folks who have questions for either Andy or Todd?
Sure. So I'm really interested in the pathway to closure at this point. So I appreciate your point, Andy, about focusing on Obama's legacy, because there's some level of self-interest in that for him. And I can see how that could affect him in some way. But let's say we somehow rally enough support and become a powerful enough voice to convince Obama to be concerned about his legacy. What's next after that? I mean, aside from lifting the moratorium, what can Obama do at this point? And what are the other avenues that we should be aware of at this point to actually move towards closure? Not just of the prison, but of the whole framework. Like, what can we do about that?
Well, for the whole framework, I would say we have to work on trying to persuade as many American people as possible that sustaining the cost of the military-industrial complex is ruinous for the American economy, and that should be obvious if you look around. But we haven't got there yet, so it's obviously a difficult case to make. But I think money has got to be a key way going forward to say we can't afford to be this crazed military empire that we are. We cannot afford it. I would say that in the long run, surely that's going to work on it. But there are no set answers for any of these things. What I hope is that I'm working with Tom Wilner, who's a very well-connected lawyer who worked on the Supreme Court cases, knows a lot of people, and he and other people that he knows, I don't know anyone with access to the Obama administration, but they know people. And what we're trying to do is find a way that anyone who knows anyone who's connected can say, come on guys, you know that you can't really leave office in 4 years' time. 8 years after this all started and having failed to do anything, you can't. How bad is that going to look? And like you say, it's a matter of self-interest. If maybe that's the reason that we have a lever is because this isn't just something objective. There is a direct legacy consequence. So it's finding a way to try and put the word out of we know that you do have your moments where you're thinking, we're really going to go down as the people who spent 8 years doing nothing and left everything worse than we inherited it, or do you want to start talking? And we want to talk to you. So lawyers who have experience, who can start to propose what the solutions are, can do that. So what are the solutions? If that's going to happen, well, obviously President Obama or somebody in the administration needs to find the courage to stand up to the critics within his own party and the Republican Party. And he's not that kind of president. But somebody's got to find the courage to stand up to the people that are stopping things from happening. And he can do, because if the Defense Secretary has to tell Congress that it's okay to do something, well, do it. Start the conversation to say, you see, the position that we're in at the moment is that nothing is going to happen. Now that's about as bad as it could be, but it means that anything that we can try, we can push as something that is better than what's happening now. He has to find ways to overcome Congress. He can do that by, the administration can start to talk to the American people to say, more than they've done at the moment, to actually say, we need to release some of these people because this is a huge embarrassment. As well as being, they always throw that thing in about this is hurting us abroad. Well, damn right it's hurting us abroad. Because every principle of how you should treat people when you're holding them has been thrown out the window. And this is Obama, this is not Bush. We know he inherited something bad from Bush, but he owns this absolutely now. So it's pushing on that. It's trying to point out again, all I've done for all these years is try to point out that these are human beings and tell their stories. And I know that you've adopted these men's stories in all of your actions. You've identified with people who are there. So, let's work out how we can do that, or how we can actively do that. We have 55 names now on a list that was released by the Department of Justice of prisoners who are actually officially cleared for release. We didn't know exactly who they were before. The lawyers weren't allowed to talk about it. Now the government did that because it said we have to keep quiet about everything because we're trying to negotiate sensitive sensitive arrangements with other countries that can take prisoners who can't be safely returned home. I more or less think that they were telling the truth. But it's always convenient with Guantánamo to hide things behind layers of classification. But they released the names. So we know who these people are. Now, you know, I wrote an article a few months ago where I explained a little bit more about who these people are. I have promised to my colleagues in close Guantánamo and the organizations that I'm meeting that I will try and get things in place to try and get the attorneys for these men to start to talk about the guys that they represent. Now, half of these people are Yemenis, so you know they provide the category that we can push on that basis. That the Yemenis are you know even more hard done by than everybody else in this appalling situation where you clear for release when you don't get to become free. So we have to make a case for the Yemenis, and you know we can, I hope, do more of that thing of humanizing them, of telling the stories, of trying to get. Maybe we'll start trying to get in touch with their family members and start trying to find the stories which will demonstrate, you know, these are not significant people, and to do that again. You know, I've got another ongoing project of of demonstrating that what the government claims is evidence is completely untrustworthy. That I will carry on doing because I think that I was going to say it's kind of the key to things. It's not. There is no key to things. There's no magic solution to any of this. But you know, the government reached a certain level in its analysis of who the prisoners are, in which they trusted too much in the information that was made available by the government. In the same way that the DC Circuit Court did, those conservative judges decided that what the government was saying was the truth, when most of what the government was saying, they had no idea whether it was true or not, and a lot of it was lies that they packaged up as though it was the truth. You know, it is deeply shocking on an ongoing basis how unreliable what purports to be the evidence is. And actually, you know, any of you can do it. If you know, don't work for the government, you can go and look at the WikiLeaks files that were released. You can go and do what I've done and go through those documents and see who's making the allegations against people. And if people want to do that, you know, maybe what we should do is you can talk to me and I'll tell you, watch out for these numbers of prisoners. The prisoners, those files are full of allegations that are made about the prisoners by their fellow prisoners. And when you start to examine them, you realize that there are patterns, that certain prisoners are coming up over and over and over again, telling lies about their fellow prisoners. How do we know that they're lies? Because in the case of the most notorious liar, and I'm not blaming him for being a liar, you know, when you're put under the kind of pressure that people are put under in Guantánamo, there are all kinds of reasons why people would give in and say, yeah, what do you want me to tell you? I'll tell you whatever you want. Because we know that over and over again, he's identifying people being in places when they weren't there. He's saying over and over again, oh yeah, I saw this guy at the training camp in 1999. And we know that this young man in question was back at home in his home country in that year. You know, and over and over and over again. And the same people making these groundless allegations. And once you start to remove them, there's really nothing there. You know, now I know that, and I'm sure some of you know that, but as a general rule, people don't know that. And you know, it's deeply embarrassing. You know, there are two things really about the war on terror that we still haven't really managed to get across, because the most single convincing piece of black propaganda, the most powerful piece of black propaganda put out by the Bush administration was the worst of the worst, that so many people believe. But you know, this is not true, and one of the things that we really have to make the case for is how embarrassing it is that the supposed intelligence is no such thing. I mean, it is actually chronically embarrassing. How a bunch of people that were bought, that they knew nothing about, were put in Guantánamo, and then reasons had to be manufactured for why they were held. Now, you know, to varying degrees, I don't think people that were involved in it looked at it that way. I think they thought, hey, these are bad guys who are trained to resist our interrogation, so we have to break them. But, you know, the shocking truth is, no, you had a bunch of nobodies, and you tortured or otherwise abused them until they gave you a load of information that made it look like your horrible project was actually worthwhile. That's the truth. You know, that's embarrassing. Now that involves, you know, I think that should involve legal consequences, not as much as the torture program. You know, where high-level government lawyers told the senior officials in the Bush administration, hey, torture isn't torture anymore, guys, and I've got a memo that will protect you. You know, that's really serious criminality. But you know, the criminality is there absolutely in what happened at Guantánamo, and it's exposing that. Because actually, you know, if you have a cursory glance at what the right-wingers do, and some of those, you know, horrible, well-funded think tanks do, they've analysed the documents that were released by WikiLeaks, and they've spun it as, look, this proves that these are such bad guys, because they accept every word at face value. We can debunk almost all of that, you know, so you're welcome to come and get involved in that project if you think that would be useful. Because I only just thought this now because of your question, so thank you. But there is no reason that this can't become a bigger project in which anyone who feels that they're capable of analysing the situation and debunking it can do that.
Thank you. Yeah, so Andy talking about WikiLeaks reminds me, he was able to find out all this information by comparing statements and whatnot, and to figure out that, you know, some of the people who are making the accusations are making numerous accusations and they're not supported by the evidence. But as defense attorney in the military office of military chief defense counsel under the Department of Defense, we were forbidden to look at WikiLeaks. We didn't have access to that information upon the risk of penalty for violating the order of not looking at WikiLeaks. So that's one thing. In these so-called new revised or reformed military commissions, we can't even look at the information that, you know, some non-military person, you know, non-defense counsel can look at. Another thing I want to mention that made me think of it, Andy talked about some innocent people, you know, numerous innocent people being picked up. Ali Soufan, the FBI agent who very prominent, he spoke out against torture. In his book, he pointed out that when we first came into Afghanistan and we gave some vehicles to the Northern Alliance, for example, there were instances where they would take their new vehicle, drive into some remote village, and offer the villager a ride on the vehicle to somebody who'd never seen such a thing before, who hopped on, you know, eager to get a ride, and then got taken over to the U.S. Army and turned in for a bounty. That's Ali Soufan of the FBI who said that. And one final thing, in talking about torture, Ibrahim al-Kosi went back to Sudan last July after serving his sentence. But Sudan is still listed on the as a state sponsor of terror, which is debatable, but nevertheless, they're on that list. And under the 2012 NDAA, well, actually before, it was prohibited, or you know, that no detainee could be returned to a state sponsor of terrorism. So when Ibrahim al-Kosi was sentenced, and we knew that the time would be coming, it would be time for him to go home, we had to somehow, you know, that matter had to be resolved. When the 2012 NDA was being written, there did get to be a small exception carved into it that said, you know, nobody can be returned to state sponsored terrorism except for if they have already been convicted in a military commission and have served their sentence. That only applied to two people in Guantánamo, Ibrahim al-Kosi and another Sudanese detainee, Nur Mohammed. So Ibrahim al-Kosi got the benefit of that exception. In the 2013 NDAA, that exception has now been taken out. So talk about torture. First, he's held under offenses that the DC Circuit Court of Appeals have now said are not offenses. He gets sentenced for that. Pleads guilty because that's the only way to get out of there. So how do you want to get out of there? Well, You know, you got to plead to something. Ibrahim al-Kosi pleaded to cooking, and he did his time. And you know, so here's Nur Mohammed now. So he pleads guilty, following the example of Ibrahim al-Kosi. Pleads guilty, gets sentenced. He too has a date that he's supposed to be released. Ibrahim al-Kosi goes home because of this exception. And at the same time, two things going on at the same time. The DC Circuit says, well, these aren't even exceptions. But at the same time, Congress is taking that exception out that would have allowed him to go back to Sudan. So now he's sitting there again with no, you know, how can he get released when there's that prohibition of him being sent back to Sudan? And that means indefinite detention. I can't think of a better example of torture than that. And finally, let me say, I grew up being very anti-totalitarian and molding up to know the Berlin Wall and all these horror stories and whatnot of both the Nazis and the communists, the Soviets, and was found it very repulsive. And now some recent polling shows the two countries in the world that are generally exercising some form of military government, Israel in occupied territories, and the United States in the world, I guess, you know, exercising this, have become the two most unpopular countries to the world's population. One final thing, going back to Nur Mohammed, if China pulled that sort of thing, or when the Soviet Union used to play with their political prisoners, or you know, whatever sort of prisoner like this, you know, first you're going to get out, then you're not going to, then maybe, now you're not. We would condemn that. The United States condemned it. Everybody, you know, our government condemned it. Human rights people condemned it. The population knew that this was totally unacceptable human behavior for a government. And now we routinely do it. And we still condemn China for doing the same sort of things for their human rights activists when they, you know, get detained and this and that. So anyway, is it any wonder that the rest of the world sees these policies as being so hypocritical?
Okay, I see some more questions. I saw one over here before, and then maybe we can get one afterward. So go ahead.
Yeah, a two-part question, and you touched on one part of it a minute ago, Andy. What do you know about anything that's being done to assist the families of these men who are in Guantánamo? And are there any programs to help the families? I would think that would help the men as well if they knew that there were efforts being made to support their families, and it would show the families that there are Americans or others who care about them. And the second part of the question is, there was an article in the Times today relating to apparently that the U.S. has created its own definitions of war crime, and that some crimes that these men have been charged with as war crimes are not recognized under international law as war crimes. And I wondered if we could comment on that at all.
Well, that's what the Blue case. That's what the Blue case is about. Again, at the very beginning, when all this started back in 2002, first they took the term unlawful combatant, ripped it out of context and cured, and say that anything that unlawful combatants do is inherently, you know, illegal. And then, as evidence of that, they took this. They made up these offenses: materials, corporate terrorism, conspiracy, because conspiracy can so easily reach somebody who has no involvement with the act itself or the crime, or just somehow or other is associated, you know, by a system of I think the term is daisy chaining. I mean, he knows him and he knows she, and on and on. And so you say, oh, okay, this is all a giant conspiracy. So it's a very useful offense. I mean, the Soviets thought it was a wonderful offense back in the end of World War II, and they're getting ready for Nuremberg. You know, this is great. We can grab everybody with a conspiracy offense. And the United States, they took that, and they were the ones promoting it. And the French and the British said, no, this is not a war crime, nor, you know. So conspiracy has never been an international war crime, except for conspiracy to commit genocide or conspiracy to commit aggressive war. But conspiracy as a criminal offense is not an international war crime, nor is solicitation or what we're calling material support for terrorism. These are inchoate offenses. Offenses that somebody didn't actually commit a crime, but just has some association with maybe, or, but we tried to turn those in. And what we did, though, was we did it by a process of analogy. So, as I mentioned, the Civil War is a very popular war for prosecutors in these cases, because they can look to a case, and again, Winthrop, and they love quoting Winthrop, William Winthrop, Colonel Winthrop. He talks very extensively, though, about these offenses that are violations of loyalty owed to the sovereign of the territory you're in. So, military commissions, as Winthrop says, they don't require any precision language. It's just sufficient that they're in violation of this principle of the law of war, that you owe this unblemished loyalty to the sovereign. So, so somebody, gets picked up and alleged to be a guerrilla, for example, and also maybe sending a letter to their Confederate son, and because they're in the North, and it violates the rule of prohibitions on correspondence. So they get charged for being in violation of the law of war, but the offense itself may be nothing more than having sent a letter to the Confederate son. That's an actual example of a violation of this. Or it may be somebody burning a bridge. But burning a bridge in the United States when you're a U.S. citizen, that's an act of disloyalty. The underlying offense was really the disloyalty, which they call war treason. And there's books, a book I just come across by the Solicitor General of the War Department explaining all this. And making a very fine point, emphasizing that some of the worst of these traitors were people like judges who might interfere with the military rule going on by considering maybe trying to give an order to release somebody. That's the law of war as applied under the Civil War, but they've taken those cases, and again, the language was never required to be specific, so they might say, these two people planned on something or other, conspired, but in fact their offense was really an act of disloyalty. But the language was never specific, so they grabbed this grab bag of language and said, "Oh yeah, conspiracy is an offense." And they took those cases that happened domestically in the United States continent and tried to say, "Well, these are international war crimes." Well, they lost, or they saw that the fallacy of their argument after we responded, the Blue team and the Hongdong team, showing how fallacious that argument was. So then they fell back and said, "Oh yeah, but this is our domestic law war." Okay, and we can apply our domestic law war to Afghanistan. Well, and it seems like, some people begin to realize how fallacious that claim is too. So that's where these offenses arose out of, mainly out of the Civil War, dealing only with examples of disloyal citizens, and the Confederates had belligerents' rights. They treated them as soldiers. There was the people in the North who were being tried and charged this way under the military commissions, but they're being charged and tried for disloyalty, regardless of what they actually called it. But the government has taken that language out of those things and said these are international war crimes. Well, they've been rebuked so far at the higher levels of the courts, and they're probably going to try to go to the Supreme Court yet, and it has to be known. It has to be made known to people. Wait a minute, they're just bringing these fallacious, charges, trying to make something stick to continue saying that these are the worst of the worst terrorists.
Just briefly on that, yeah. I mean, it was when the Obama administration wanted to bring back the military commissions. What do they get called? The reformed military commissions. Obama administration officials told Congress that they felt that material support would be successfully overturned on appeal. That was David Criss, who, do you remember, was he a lawyer at the State Department?
Could be.
And Jay Johnson. They both testified to Congress that they told Congress, we do not want you, we advise you not to keep material support for terrorism because we think it will be overturned on appeal. And that is what happened in September in al-Balud's case, which has thrown a huge spanner in the works of what tattered remnants of credibility the military commission system had, I think. It's going to make it difficult going forward for the majority of cases. So many of the cases, that was all that they had. So these people now join the rest of the prisoners in limbo, unfortunately. That many that were put forward by the task forces designated for trial are not going to be tried. So, you know, I suppose we need to go forward, we need to address the fact that we have even more people held without charge or trial indefinitely, because they're sure as hell not going to be freed. So, you know, I mean, to me, the bitterest thing about the military commissions was the plea deal that Omar Khadr had to agree to get released from Guantánamo, where a 15-year-old as he was at the time, you know, he had to say that as a 15-year-old in an occupied country, engaging in combat with the occupying force who had attacked him, that he was a war criminal. He had to agree that to be released from Guantánamo. That, you know, that's disgusting. So if the credibility is going, and it seems that it is, don't you think, Todd?
It should be doing. I mean, people saying these are reformed, and they should be ashamed. I can't emphasize how much I believe that somebody out there saying these commissions are reformed, how ashamed it should be, because this is the sort of thing we condemned so vigorously back in the 1980s and 70s and 60s when the Soviets did it, and what we still condemn, and yet we have high government officials, military prosecutors saying, you know, how well we reformed these things and how proud they are defending these sorts of things that the rest of the world can clearly see through. They are transparent. The world sees through the you know, false claims that we're making, how fair these things are, because there's so many levels of unfairness in it. Latif, you know, once in a while we see a picture of detainees out playing soccer, but you know, I suspect, and I won't, you know, Latif was a more typical detainee. He was, you know, there's plenty of them I suspect that are pretty comatose where they're at, and we don't get to see all of them, to see how poorly some of their mental conditions really are. So again, if the Soviet Union should have been ashamed when this all came to light, if China should be ashamed for the way they treat some of the people in their country, we should be ashamed too, is the way I look at it, because it's the same behavior.
Thanks, Todd. Your other question was about support for the families.
Yes.
And you mean support for the families of the prisoners who are still held?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, I don't know what the situation is with that. I mean, my fear, and in some ways I know that it's true, but I don't know the extent to which it's true, is that even with the best will in the world, a lot of the attorneys representing the prisoners will have been finding, as time has gone on and President Obama's hope has turned to ashes, that, you know, that a lot of the prisoners are not, they've given up. You know, what is the point when, you know, it was the biggest insult to them really was to have these guys, you know, standing up and cheering when President Obama got in, because the lawyers had been going to see them and saying, it's looking good, guys. You know, and then to hear about the executive order for the closure of the prison, and now to be in the position that they are, you know, I think that obviously it's become difficult, and you know, I can't quantify it because you know, I haven't seen it reported anywhere or talked about. But I know, you know, from conversations that I've had that some of the prisoners have just given up on seeing their lawyers. Because they can't see any point. So it would seem to me that a lot of that work of trying to reach out and support people has probably come to a halt. And also, you know, now that the United States is engaged in so much terrorist activity against Yemen, I'd imagine that people are a lot less welcome there than they used to be. You know, I don't think I've ever uttered that phrase, the terrorist activity that the United States is visiting on Yemen, but that is, it seems to me, is what's happening. You know, I know in the past lawyers have been out there and have talked to the families, and you know, I don't know whether people are still going out. I just fear with the current situation that may not be the case. But one of the things that I had been hoping to do was to try and approach the lawyers of some of the Yemeni detainees to say, what information have you got? Have you got stories of the families, at least, and other information that we can use in an attempt to humanize their sons and brothers?
Thank you.
So I sense that other people have questions, but because of time, I wonder if folks with questions can try to grab Andy or Todd after we conclude and see there's some conversation there. I would like to close our time. For those of you who weren't with us this morning, Witness Against Torture Circle, Luke Nephew, who's a part of Witness Against Torture, wrote an incredible poem. Deborah has something.
I'm sorry, I
That's okay.
didn't interrupt.
Oh, that's fine.
Andy's film is here.
Oh, great. Okay.
Deborah's brought 5 copies of the DVD of the film that I co-directed with Polly Nash outside the Law Stories from Guantánamo, which, if anyone is interested, I'm now holding them, but talk to Deborah. Okay.
Great.
Sorry, commercial over.
Oh,
Very quickly, so lately I and 3 others have formed a group, the Institute for the Study of American Militarism. And our argument is, and it's a direct response to those people who are saying, you know, we got this emergency, we got to put the Constitution aside. Our argument is no, the Constitution has been our strength. We started off, use a term out of the preamble where it says this Constitution is established to provide for the common defense. We're going to call ourselves the Committee for the Common Defense. Somebody sort of took that, and we found a better term, the Institute for the Study of American Militarism. And the point is that, number one, the Constitution is our strength, and so American militarism is inherently hostile to our constitutional order. And second, this idea that we need to resort to the military is counter to military's doctrine itself, going back to before Cheney became the world's greatest strategist. The military used to understand that war was so expensive and unpredictable, you tried to avoid it. It didn't mean you couldn't use military forces when they were necessary for some sporadic attack or something, or response. And again, always recognize it had to be a military necessity for it. But it recognized that counterinsurgency, counterterrorism were something other than war. And you wanted it to be something other than war. When 2000, with 9/11 and Cheney and that gang, they turned that on its head and said, you know, the best defense is good offense, so let's go on the offensive throughout the world and these wars. And now we have people saying, yeah, we're going to have multi-generational wars. All that means is that we're going to bankrupt our own people, and we're going to create a strategic detriment to our own country, because you cannot be strong when so much of the world is hostile to you because of your warlike activities. That's why the Soviet Union was hated so much by so much of the world.
great. Okay.